Let's talk about seller concessions. What are the benefits of seller concessions? What are seller concessions? So seller concessions are essentially a credit from the seller to the buyer, and they can be for multiple different things. A couple of different scenarios, right? Seller concessions can be asked for and provided by a seller to a buyer. Right out of the gate as part of the initial contract offer. That would be, for example, if you're coming in to buy a house, and you ask the seller as part of your offer that they accept to cover some of your closing costs. Let's just say, for example, $5,000 worth of your closing costs. That can be part of the deal that's negotiated originally. The seller's paying for that, basically just as part of the sale price. And what that does is it reduces their cash. So it's essentially the same as you buying the house for $5,000 less from the seller's perspective. It's the same net amount of cash to them. If you buy a house for $400,000 with $5,000 in seller concessions, or if you buy a house for $395,000 with $0 in seller concessions, the same net amount goes to the seller in that scenario. The other thing that seller concessions can be for is for issues that are potentially found on an inspection, right? So I'll give you an example. We recently had a deal that was $675,000 purchase price. Everything on the inspection came back very good, with the exception of some damage to the liner on the pool, right? So what we did is we went out and we researched quotes. We determined how much would it cost. First, we had somebody dive the pool to determine exactly where the leaks were coming from, and they determined that the liner was a vinyl lined pool. The liner was basically at the end of its life and needed to be replaced. So we called up a bunch of companies that do this vinyl lining replacement. We determined that the cost to replace the vinyl lining was going to be between $6,000 and $7,000. And then we called the seller and basically shared the results of the inspection report with them. Told them that we did all our due diligence. We determined that the vinyl liner in your pool needs to be replaced, and it's going to cost $6,000 to $7,000 to do so. So we respectfully request $7,000 as a credit, seller concessions, so that when the customer purchases the house, they can have the money to replace that pool and bring it up to good condition. They agreed. So what they are getting is they are getting a $7,000 credit towards the closing costs on the home, and it's very similar to the concept of if I pay you $10 and you pay me $10, how much money has changed hands. So basically the seller, instead of directly paying for repairs to this pool, the seller is paying $7,000 worth of the buyer's closing costs, which the buyer no longer has to pay. So therefore they have $7,000 in additional cash that they no longer have to come up with. And that $7,000 in additional cash that they no longer have to come up with can be used to replace the liner in the pool. So it's like almost like a shell game. The reason is if there are things that are allowed to be listed on a sales contract as credits, and there are things that are not allowed when you're financing a deal. So basically, if we were to put something on a contract that says the seller is paying $7,000 for replacement of their defective pool, then that's going to open up a can of worms with a lender or an investor, where they start to say, oh, is there a problem with the pool? We need to see that that's done prior to closing, and we want an inspection of the pool that shows that everything's been fixed. So in order to avoid that, we have it listed as credit. It's paid, it's used to pay closing costs. It's not used to pay the pool. And then the buyer uses that money that they otherwise would have spent on closing costs to do the repairs after the fact, after they close the deal. So, what's good about this is that it allows you to, move forward on a house that may not be perfect, which unless you're even on a new construction house, there's typically things that aren't perfect. So it allows you to move forward with the transaction and have, money change hands, so that you don't have to come out of pocket, because if you were to just reduce the sales price, right, you can't get that money back. You know what I mean? You would have a monthly payment that is probably $50 a month less, which is great. But then you would need to come up with that additional $7,000 to fix the pool, which you may not have if you're a first-time home buyer. Not everybody has $7,000 just laying around, sitting, waiting to be spent. So that's the deal. That's seller concessions in a nutshell. Usually one of those two One of those two situations, either on the initial offer or based on inspection findings.